Hello, friends. Last week we were talking about creation or evolution and which one was actually true. And so today we're on lesson 2 of the series, and so stay right there as we're going to continue with this lesson.
With all the confusion in the religious world today, there is still truth in the world. From the Central Church of Christ, located in Saraland, Alabama, we bring you Central Bible Talk.
Hello, friends, and welcome to Central Bible Talk. My name is Wes Garland.
I'm Clifford Newell.
And we are just so very delighted to have you join us today as we get into this study some more. Friends, last week we were talking about which is true, creation or evolution, and we talked about a whole lot of things. And just by a quick refresher on what we've actually talked about is that we were talking about basically Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, which easily states, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, the question that arose last week was the fact that, is this a factual account, or is it that evolution is the factual account? Because it's either the Bible is actually saying what actually happened, or mankind, which is also stemming from atheism down to humanism, which simply means that man has a mind. Stop using God as a crutch, use your own mind, right? That's basically humanism that is summarized in a nutshell. See, there's individuals that are out here that are basically saying that creation does not actually fit the facts that they are finding, and then there's those who say that evolution is actually what is making the facts of what actually took place in our own human origin. Now, what we're actually going to be talking about today is basically going a little bit further into this, but I want you to just show yourself really to what extent they're willing to go in relationship to this evolutionary thought. On the screen, you have an individual by the name of Charles Smith who simply made this statement. In the beginning was matter, which begat the amoeba, which begat the worm, which begat the fish, which begat the amphibian, which begat the reptile, which begat the lower mammal, which begat the lemur, which begat the monkey, which begat man, who imagined God. Now, friends, we have got to understand what he's actually saying here. He's saying that God is only in existence because he is just being thought of in an imaginary way from man. That man was the one who created God and all that. Well, basically what he's saying is that God is a fictional character. Now, with that being the case, he's got some things he's got to prove, doesn't he? Because the fact is, are you able to close your eyes and see facts, or do you have to open your eyes to see the facts? See that there's a difference, isn't there? So when we're talking here about creation and evolution, understand that evolution is actually stemmed from atheism, which simply says that there is no God. And it's sad, Clifford, how individuals try to mingle both of these thoughts, and they call themselves creation evolutionists. Mm-hmm. Can that actually be done?
No, it can't. They're two different fields, mm-hmm. two different studies. Something that perhaps would be wise for us to point out with this statement that came from Mr. Smith mm-hmm. is, if you'll notice, and I think the Bible is very clear about this, that we do not have the crossing of species from one kind to another kind.
No.
The Bible simply states that in Genesis 1 that everything will produce after its own kind.
Exactly.
And we talked about the illustration. We said apples will never become oranges, grapefruit will never become pumpkins, and we go on and on and on this way. That's a stated fact. That is a scientific fact that can mm-hmm. be proved in the realm of science. Mm-hmm. Now, perhaps someone may be thinking, and I thought about this a little bit earlier, there is a difference between science, true science, and scientism.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
True science can be viewed and studied and can be tested with known scientific facts. Scientism basically is the figment of one's imagination. They can do whatever. For example, those that found the jawbone of an ox and they created a man from that using plaster of Paris. A number of different things. But friends, basically when we talk about evolution, we are talking about where they believe that this earth is somewhere between 4.3 billion years to infinitely old. And if you look up those words, you know, what does infinitely mean? It's unlimited.
It's unlimited, exactly.
And so they're not even in agreement as to how old this earth is. But it's all due to a fact that when you read that statement by Charles Smith, that when it went through all of this process, and then man who imagined God, we say and contend that evolution is a godless form of religion.
Absolutely.
And we mean it that way. It is wanting to strike God out of it completely. God had nothing to do. That after the creationary acts of God, that he adopted the hands-off policy, he sat back, and this is where we are today. Well, that says a lot about God that I'm just not willing to accept. I'm not willing to throw God under the bus like that. Let me tell you something. Everything that we have is here because God created it.
Exactly.
And he may not have created it in that exact form. Man can certainly have corrupted things and has. But God created everything. And I call your attention to the fact in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, after he created many of these things, God saw that it was good. And at the conclusion of chapter 1, in verse 31, he says, it was very good. So are we saying that God created evil? Are we saying that God created all of these things in the state and form that it is, and it has evolved into this? We're not saying that at all.
Absolutely
and I hope
not.
people certainly will understand. But Wes, during this hour now, we're going to really concentrate ourselves into looking at, because of this time frame, where is it possible that one can fit this time in, and does it fit?
Well, I mean, it's just logically thinking about this. There's only 3 possibilities of the time being put into it.
Okay.
It's either before the days of creation, during the days of creation, or after the days of creation. Because, I mean, if you want to talk about creation evolutionists, right, that try to mingle that which is false with that which is true, with the biblical account and things, they have to put it in somewhere. And so because of that, you're going to be introduced to a lot of different theories, all right? The first of which is basically, they say that's known as the gap theory, that there's a big gap in between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and chapter 1 and verse 2.
Right.
Now, I think it's very interesting. If you look on the screen, you're going to see this. Watch what it says in verses 1 and 2. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, all of a sudden, they say there's a gigantic break right there in context. Then it says, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So, they say that between 1:1 and 1:2, there's a gigantic gap in between these 2 verses. And why would they say that? Well, they would say that because they've got to fit time in there somewhere. And therefore they say, well, that first earth, where God created everything, according to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, after a period of time, God just absolutely just destroyed that. And then all of a sudden in verse number 2, this is the recreation Now, whenever you're talking here about the gap theory, my friends, understand this. They contend that God created man and woman and the earth, but the earth became so corrupt that they had to destroy it. And then on top of that, during this proposed gap, there lived successively generations of plants, animals, and even a pre-Adamic men. Now, I want you to think about really what we're talking about with this. They're trying to say that there was a previous creation before the creation that we actually have now. That there was race, there was people. On top of that, there were plants, there were animals, all these other things. And then even on top of that, it goes a little bit further. They even say that the earth became actually a waste and a void. Now, I've got to ask this question. If you're going to say there's a big gap and the first earth just became waste and void and there was a pre-Adamic race that was there were animals, there were plants, everything like that, what makes this earth sustainable when God wasn't even, according to them, successful in the first making? That's a good question.
Absolutely it
If
is.
if he was incapable of making a sustainable earth the first time, what makes you think that now all of a sudden, oh, this is a whole new creation, this is something that's now sustainable, this is now billions of years old, and you have to ask yourself the question, okay, if he messed up then, what makes you say that he didn't mess up now? See, there's a big problem with that gap theory.
Absolutely there is. And because if God could make a mess up, then he cannot be God.
Exactly.
By every understanding of that definition. I find it interesting with all of this that it is a contention that they have, and yet they're not unanimous in this.
No, no.
Even though this gap theory in all of its modifications, there are a number of modified aspects of it through the years. But this seems to be the most widely accepted idea about where all the time came from. There are some that we'll deal with in the next point when we get there. But they believe that there's this huge gap. And when we say a huge gap, we're talking about billions of years, okay? Now, something that was pointed out last week, and I think it stands merit for us to point it out again. How is it that men so far removed from an event today know more about that event than the people during that time frame?
Exactly. It's like, I mean, think about this. We even brought up what was questioned to Job.
Yeah.
He said, okay, if you think you know so much,
Right.
where were you whenever I did this? Where were you whenever I did this? Where were you whenever I did this? Please explain all this to me. And see, that is where mankind gets themselves a problem.
That's right.
When they themselves think that they have the mind that supersedes the mind of God.
Right.
Who can say, okay, God was there. He's explaining to Moses by inspiration how everything came to be. But yet we now know more than what Moses did whenever he was inspired by God to write these things. When God was the one who was there, who created all things, inspiring Moses to write these things down. Does man today know more than God?
That's ludicrous, isn't it?
That is a ludicrous thought.
But that's exactly what is being contended.
Yes.
That they know. So there was this race that God created, and then because that race became so corrupt and immoral, God had to destroy it. And then when you read verse 2, you read how the earth was without form and void. That's the way that God created it until it was adorned. That's not talking about, and you have to read into this. And let me caution you here, friends. We are to exegete the Bible. In other words, we're to literally bring out what its meaning is, not read into it thoughts and ideas that we have. And so a true exegesis of Genesis 1 is going to show there is no gap here. This is the way God created it. The Spirit was hovering over the face of the deep. And then you're going to begin to read how that God created daylight and darkness, how He did all of these things. And then at the end of Genesis 1, it was though that God licked His finger and spun the earth and put it in its, set it on its axis, and how that the earth rotates every, one time every what? 365 days.
Yes.
And it has been that way, except there's a certain time frame over there in the book of Joshua where that didn't happen, where it stood still for,
for
10 degrees?
Yeah, for 24 hours.
And that's right, 24 hours. And man has done research, and they can come up to that point, but they can't get beyond that because they do not accept the biblical account.
They even NASA has said there is still a missing day in there, and we can't figure out what it is.
That's right.
Well, we know what it was.
That's right.
If you just simply accept what was said.
That's right.
Now, I think it's important to stop right here and explain something to our audience. Whenever you're talking about Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, he is making a profound statement, a fact.
Right.
And then beginning in verse number 2, talks about how that all came to be. Right? He's not talking about a separation, that there was a first earth and then all of a sudden that one was destroyed. Then verse number 2 is now dealing with a new creation. That's not what he's talking about. It's the same way even if you go over here to Genesis chapter 2 and you start reading here about verses 1 through 3 and talking about the seventh day. And then in verse number 4 it says that this is the history of what took place. And then all of a sudden you realize that Moses, starting in verse number 4 through the rest of the chapter, is reflecting on day 6 of how man was created and how man and woman were created and all of that. So these are profound statements, not saying that all of a sudden, like in verse number 3, that's the whole entire end of creation, and then all of a sudden verse number 4 starts with a new creation. No. Verse 2 is just explaining the process of verse number 1.
Right.
Chapter 2, verse 4 begins the process of what took place in day 6.
That's right.
So
That's right.
I think it's important for everybody to understand that.
You know, there's another point that they often make that I think is warranted of our noticing. If you notice on the screen, they say that the earth became waste and void. In fact, some of their literature that we have access to, they put had become. They translate that had become, which would indicate that that wasn't its earliest form.
Exactly.
Now, is there any proof of such? Well, we're here before you today to say absolutely none.
There is none.
We're going to begin looking at a number of ways that the Scripture use to talk about this, okay?
And so what are some of those references that really hit home in showing that the gap theory is false?
Okay, I'm
What
glad
are
you
some of
asked. Let's open our Bibles.
That's right.
And let's look
That's
look in them. Look at Exodus 20 and verse number 11. In Exodus 20 and verse 11, here is the account of the commandments as they were given and all that was taking place. And notice this. Here's what Moses penned about this as these 10 commandments. Verse 11 says, but for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath, and he hallowed it. Now, how do I know that he's talking about the days of creation? Well, if we went back to verse 1, we could have established this. He said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. He said, number 1, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make any carved or graven image. You shall not bow down. and show mercy or anything. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. The fourth, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy.
And then he explains it,
That's right.
how it all came to be.
When he said the Sabbath always meant seventh. Okay? Seventh what? Day. And so here's an explanation now of what the Bible means, what the Lord meant when he said, what does he say? He says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day, he said, it is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall neither do no work, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger or that is within your gates. Why? For in 6 days the Lord God made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day.
Now you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, and then the very first 3 verses of chapter 2. It's explaining exactly what he's talking about right here in verse 11.
That's right. Yeah. Now, with that, and we'll use these verses again, but with that, what is he trying to say? He's trying to say that there is no difference between verse 1 and verse 2, that it is a continuation of thought, a statement, and then he begins to identify what was to take place. So Exodus 20 and verse 11, in 6 days, that's something that we need to hold on to.
Absolutely.
But if the Lord meant what he said and said what he meant, when you read the last verse of Genesis 1, and where the Bible says, and it was very good, okay? What was he talking about?
His creation.
How do we know that?
Because whenever you're seeing the continuation of verse number 2 all the way down through and seeing the 6th day as creation, he's now looking at everything that he had created. And he says it was good, but then he looked at everything a second time and he says, boy, it was very good.
That's right.
Right?
That's right. Look at the very words of the text.
Exactly.
In Genesis 1 and verse 31, then God saw everything that he had made or created. And by the way, there's no difference between these two words, made and created, Asa and bara. They're used interchangeably. And when we go back to that Exodus passage again, we'll see that. But everything that God had made, and indeed it was very good, looking back at creation. So we have to ask the question, if God saw what he had made and it was very good, then please explain to me how it became so corrupt that God had to destroy it and then remake it.
Well, another thing that I've got to go back to, if God messed up the first time, then what makes him have the ability to make the second one very good? I mean, it doesn't make any sense to think that way. Now, another thing that we need to remind ourselves about is that we are to draw out from the text what is there and not put something else in that is not there, right? Let me give you an example. If you turn your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, my friends, and look at verse number 45. This is a very key passage because in this he's trying to explain the new glorious body, the terrestrial body from the celestial body, everything like that, right? And he uses this as an example. In verse number 45, notice what he says here. And so it was, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a living or life-giving spirit. Now, the reference that the first man, Adam. Now, this is to say that he was the very first man. Now, if you want to eisegete, which simply means to put in something that is not there, you would have to then say, well, this is in the second creation. No, what does the first mean? First means first, right? That means the very first one that came into the process. So whenever you're talking about the first man, Adam, which is what you read about in Genesis chapter 1, also Genesis chapter 2, that he took from the dust and formed man, and then he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being, right? And he called his name Adam. And then he took from the rib of Adam, after he put him into a deep sleep, took the rib out of Adam and made woman. This is now flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones. She shall be called woman because she was made out of man, right? So that whole context, that whole specific thing, understand, if he says the first man, Adam, does that mean that there is a pre-Adamic existence? No, because then he wouldn't be the first, would he? I mean, let's just think logically about this. If it's the first man, Adam, and it can be built upon evidence after evidence after evidence throughout verses, right, showing all this, because I think it's very interesting how the origin of man actually is mentioned numerous times, being proven. Why? Because that's where we all came from, and the impact that he made upon the rest of creation. So we've got to remember that even whenever you're talking about the name Eve, I think it's very important to think about this. What was the name Eve? What was the meaning of it? The mother of all living. If you're talking about the first man, Adam, then you're talking about Eve being the mother of all living, then that means there was nothing before, and if anything came after, it's because of those two individuals. Kind of interesting, don't you think? See, we know that the gap theory is false simply because it refers to death and destruction in a world that was prior to Adam, and that's not what you read about in Scripture. So you have to eisegete something there as well.
You know, Wes, another illustration of what we're talking about here, when you read in Matthew 19, you read about marriage and how God ordained it and such. And God says, but from the beginning, because they were wanting to say, why did Moses say that you could give a writing of divorce if that's not the case? And he said, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart. But from the beginning of what? We go back and we notice, where is the beginning of marriage but when God performed that ceremony between Adam and Eve, the very beginning of time. Now, friends, try to fit that in with what the evolutionists say by saying that there was this creation and it became so corrupt that God destroyed it and then had to recreate it. If he's referring to that second, then it's not in the very beginning. And if it's referring to the first, then what do you have? You had to have man and woman being married during that time. Who were they? And again, you see, it just poses all of these problems because it does not fit.
It doesn't fit.
But so we can say then that the gap theory and all of its modification just does not fit the Bible and what God wants to say.
Exactly.
But what would be another area that the evolutionists use to try to fit this time element in?
Well, some people actually go to the extent of that if they can't do it before the creation, they have to do it during the day's creation. Now, this right here is what is known as the day-age theory. Now, what they are basically contending is that this position states that every day is a long aeon or period of time. Therefore, in other words, they try to say that each day is not a literal 24-hour period, but because it is 4.3 billion years old now, each day is actually 1,000,000 years old or more. Okay? Now, I think this is a really, really big problem. And so let's go ahead and just get into these problems that arise from this. You know, one of the very first things, Clifford, that I think is a big problem with this theory is using the actual word day. What is so significant about this word day?
Okay. We have to go back to the original account This was in the Hebrew, and so we're going to have to consult the Hebrew authorities.
Exactly,
okay?
exactly.
And deal with that. What we have is whenever the Hebrew word for day is used, it's the word yom, Y-O-M. Whenever this day is used and it is preceded by a numeral, they tell us that it always carries the meaning of a literal 24-hour day.
You know, I think it's important to let people know that the word yom in and of itself in Hebrew literally just means a period of time, right? And you'll see that throughout the Hebrew Bible, right? But only when it is classified as any type of space of time, you've got to respect the text. Because that then defines that period of time or yom
Right.
in what it actually means.
As to how it is used in that
Exactly.
text. That's exactly
Exactly.
right. That's right. So that Hebrew phrase then, when we look at it, and there's something else that's interesting here. Let me begin just reading and call your attention to the fact that God said, let there be light. There was light. God saw the light. It was good. He divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and darkness He called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. At the end of each day of creation, you find that again in verse 8. And the evening and the morning of the second day. And we go on and verse 13. So the evening and the morning were the third day. The fourth, the fifth, the sixth, all the way through. The Hebrew people counted time from 6 one evening to 6 the next evening. That's why it says evening and morning. Now, the way we basically count time today, we start with the morning and go to the evening. But that's just opposite the way that they did, okay? So the evening and morning referred to a literal 24-hour period of time. Now, in each of these points, friends, what we are wanting for you to understand is, if the Hebrew word yom preceded by this number, if it doesn't mean a literal 24-hour period of time, then what does it mean? It's there. It must mean something, okay? What does it mean? If evening and morning does not refer to a literal 24-hour period of time, then again we have to ask the question, what does it mean? And when you and I take our Bibles and we read about something that happened in the very beginning to try to come away with an understanding, here's what God says I want you to know. But if those are not the things, if this is not true, then what are we to know? And you know, I find it interesting and somewhat humorous in a way, but it's almost too serious to be humorous. And that is that there is nothing offered, no proof. They say, well, it's a long eon. I've learned to pronounce that word eon, whether it's aeon or eon, of time. How do we know that? Give us a demonstration. And, you know, there's nothing. But let me tell you something. Here's one thing that you can read about in the Bible, and that is what we call the field of botany. Botany is the study of plant life, okay? And if you'll notice that it was created on the third day, verse 11. Let the earth bring forth grass and herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose kind is in itself. And it was so. And God saw all of this, and evening and morning were the third day. Now, friends, I want you to think about something. We understand, and it has been known for quite some period of time, that there are many of the plants and things that cannot survive long eon periods of time of either light or darkness.
I mean, you think about it. What happens when a plant, there's a reason why whenever you buy a plant, you have to read the instructions for that plant.
Right.
Because some of it says that you need to keep it under a shaded area. You need to keep it in daylight, or at least have 8 hours of daylight a day, and then have it shaded at night, things like that. So there's important instructions with that. Because think about this. If it had constant daylight, what would it do to a plant? It would fry it. Why do you think the desert is full of plants that are specifically to desert life? You know? Why is it desert land? Right? You've got to think about it that way. But think about this. Photosynthesis is something that is very, very important. You study this in science, and what we're talking about is true science. Right? Not this figment of imagination type science. I think you called it scientism.
Scientism.
Yeah. And so we need to make sure we understand that there is true science and there's false science, right? The act of photosynthesis is something that is very needed for a plant to survive.
Right.
That's the way it gets its energy, that's the way it gets its nutrients, that's the way it does everything, right? If that is messed up, the plant's going to die.
That's right.
If it has an overlapping period of darkness, what's going to happen to that plant? It's going to die. Over extended period of time of sunlight, it's going to die. Why is that? Because that's the way God made it.
That's right.
And you know what? I want to ask you this question. And we need to ask our audience the same question. Why did it take God 6 days to create everything? I mean, in all reality, would God not be powerful enough to go ahead, and could He have not just set everything all into being all at 1 second? Sure He could. Sure He could. Think about this. You mean to tell me you're going to question the ability of God whenever all He had to say is speak it into existence, right? And you're going to challenge that He wasn't powerful enough to do it all in one time? There's a significance of why it took Him 6 days and then He all of a sudden rested the seventh. He was making time.
Right.
And therefore, that's why it took 7 days. That's why we have 7 days in a week.
Right.
That's why we have a first day of the week. That's why we have the Sabbath day.
Right.
He set the time frame because before then, guess what? Time did not exist.
That's right.
Time didn't exist, so He had to create it.
That's right. That's why Genesis says, in the beginning. The
Beginning of what?
time.
Time.
As God created it.
Exactly.
You know, there's another illustration of this. Let's assume for just a moment that the evolutionists are correct, that there was this long eon of time in this day. If that were the case, and the Bible says, as we read here, that there was evening, what did those bees do? They couldn't pollinate.
No, they could not.
Those because they don't do that in the darkness. They do that in the daylight.
Exactly.
And your photosynthesis and the process that God was prepared. You see, friends, you can't make it make sense if you try to fit the evolutionist period of time. And so botany tells us, hey, the study of plants cannot live in this darkness or light in this extended period of time. Now,
right.
why was God telling us that? Why is that in the Bible? Because God was simply wanting us to know that those days of creation and from that time forward, time set in motion by God, is that it's a literal 24-hour period of time.
That's right.
And friends, the whole validity of truth, of righteousness, of God, of the Bible is built upon that phrase. And so, isn't it interesting how that God was so detailed in giving us that information precisely as it had happened?
You know, I think it's important how many times throughout the whole Bible that God goes back to the beginning stages of things. Because in that, he established the reason for the Sabbath. And remember that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
That's right.
So God knew that we all needed, as mankind, a day of rest. Therefore, he instilled that into the individuals. Now, with that being the case, there's a reason why he has, like at the beginning there, Matthew chapter 19, verse 4. It's a very damaging thing to the day-age theory, because the fact is, whenever he says at the beginning, he made man and female. Beginning. Okay, so whenever you think about man being made at the beginning, that means it wasn't millions of years, but it happened at the same exact, around the same time, which is actually day 6, still happening to be the case that it was at the beginning, not 6 million years down the road.
Right.
So, I mean, it's something that's just mind-boggling that people would even attempt to even go to this extent in trying to say that the earth was millions and millions and millions of years old.
Yes.
But here's the thing. So we've said that it can't be the case that it happened before creation. There is no such thing as a gap theory. It didn't happen during the days of creation.
Right.
And therefore, that very last possible place that they could even try to throw in all this time is after the days of creation.
Yes.
Which, I mean, in all reality, through my thinking and through my acknowledgement, this is where the individuals would have to go into play with the creation evolutionists, where they say, okay, in the 6 days of creation, God started everything at the get-go, but then stepped back and said, I'm going to see what happens, and just let everything happen the way it was. But at the beginning, it still doesn't match up with evolution.
No.
Because going back to what Charles Smith already said, it all started with this one little creature that all of a sudden evolved into this, into this, into this, into this, and then ultimately ending up with man, right? But in those 6 days of creation, evolution can't take place for the reason that everything was already stated as being present in 6 days. So it doesn't even match up with the whole, hey, I'm going to start everything off and just see what happens. That doesn't even fit because man was already there, beast was already there, fish and whale and shark and all that was already there, the plants were already there, all of that was already there. So where does the evolution fit?
Yeah.
It doesn't.
It just doesn't fit at all. And you know, there's some implications of evolution that I think is very, very important. And one of those implications is if God did use, now, friends, please understand, neither Wes nor myself believe in this theory.
Absolutely
But
not.
just assuming for a moment,
Let's play their game.
yeah, for sake of argument, that God did use the realm of evolution to bring about these things. The evolutionists tell us that because of that, we see how things keep getting better. But today, we understand that's not the case. If it were so, then why do we have all of these diseases, and why is it that man dies? If Methuselah was the oldest man, and I believe the Bible upholds that as the case, 969 years, why is it then that if we live 80, 90, perhaps 100, why is it then that we die if things are progressively getting better? I mean, that should be obvious to us. Even the evolutionists are dying.
And here's the thing too, if according to the evolutionary theory that man has become the most complex creation or evolved being, right? Why are we not continually getting better?
All right.
What makes it all of a sudden stop with us? I mean, you have to then assume that we are the most supreme being. You would have to assume that.
All right.
But in that respect, I mean, why are we not evolving into greater beings?
That's right. That would be the next thing. What it comes beyond human.
And then all of a sudden, according to them, we've been around for millions of years. Okay, then in all reality, what all of a sudden stopped? Is it your opinion that man has become, because that's the humanist theory, that man has a mind, therefore he does not need God, therefore use your mind and stop using God as a crutch. So therefore, whatever's in here that you can imagine becomes a solid standard of authority. So if that be the case, then what makes us all of a sudden the supreme being? It doesn't add up.
No, no. And friends, just because there are those that will put it down on paper that that's the case, doesn't mean that it's so. We have to have the evidence.
That's right.
Now, Wes, there's another problematic area that deals with this. Many believe that the first 11 chapters of Genesis is mythological. It's mythology. And help us to understand what is being said there and how that people can realize that it's not real. Mythology.
Okay,
is
so
not real.
the very first question I would even ask is, number one, why would you even want to challenge this, right? Why would you even want to even open up the door of opportunity of even having the audacity to say that chapter 12 of Genesis starts factual, but chapters 1 through 11 are false. There's myths. And you have to ask the question, why would they want to even entertain that thought? Well, what happens in the first 11 chapters? You have the creation. Then you have man and woman forming the home and marriage. Then you have the thought that, okay, in the home, it's supposed to be man and woman, therefore, it's not man and woman. So homosexuality goes out the door. Then you all of a sudden think about the first murder. Now that has to be thrown away because now murder now seems to be okay in this nation. Then you think about the table of nations there in chapter 5. Pretty important information being made mention there, right? Then all of a sudden the global flood. No, that can't be the case. So they then say that the global flood was not a global flood. It was just a localized flood, that one little instance and everything. So that's all false. Then you go a little bit further, and then all of a sudden you had the beginning of languages taking place there in chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. Why would you want to put that out? If you take out the origin of everything in relationship to the physical things of life, what have you just opened up the door to? A bunch of philosophies, a bunch of theories, a bunch of everything. Now, all of a sudden, there's no such thing as an absolute truth. Because whatever you want to believe, you can believe. Whatever I want to believe, I can believe, even though they're contradictive.
Right.
Logic itself will not even accept that.
That is exactly right.
So, with this being the case, the whole idea of Genesis carries the book of beginnings, my friends. The book of beginnings. That's what the word Genesis actually means. When we're talking about mythological, that actually means a widely held but false view. Whenever you think about everything about this, we've got to come back to the realization. If chapters 1 through 11 were false, then anything that had reference in the later books that they claim to be factual, if it has any reference to the first 11 chapters, then guess what, my friends? That would only classify it to be a fact as well. Did you know the Lord Himself talked about the beginning and the creation of man? The home, marriage. You've got there Him mentioning about the global flood there in Matthew 24. You've got all these things, and even going all the way back to Babel, making mention of in other passages. If it's all a fact, then why are they claiming it as a factual deal in the rest of the Bible?
That's right.
you've got some problems you're going to have to deal with.
That's exactly right. Now, you mentioned that the idea of Genesis carries with it the idea, the book of beginnings. Not only does the Bible start out that way, but you referred to Genesis 5 and the table of nations. Just notice this. This is the book of the genealogy of Adam, going back first man. And what does he talk about? God created man. He made him in the likeness of God. He created them, male and female, blessed them. Adam lived 130 years and begot a son, and he goes on, he gives all of these genealogical data, okay? All the way up through that, concluding with verse number 32 of Genesis 5. Why? Because each one of those was established the fact that Noah was the beginning of his family. And you read about Enoch and Cain and all of these, Seth, Cain and Abel. All of that verifies this very point, okay? That this was the book of genealogy establishing that very fact.
Think about this. You know how we were just talking about how it opens up a bunch of openings to theories and everything like that? You take away the first 11 chapters, now you do not have a standard for a time frame.
That's right.
Therefore, guess what? All of a sudden, somehow, some way, because you say chapters 1 through 11 are false, maybe the earth really is 4.5 billion years old now. But I want you to think about this. If you were to take the genealogical accounts, right, with every bit of the ages, and you start really narrowing everything down on a time frame, the earth in and of itself is only between 6,000 to 10,000 years old. So what then has to be false?
Evolution.
Evolution. Because for evolution to even have any type of credible proof at all, the one thing they have to have is time. And if you don't have the millions and millions and millions of years, and now you're only limited down to 6,000 to 10,000, according to their logic, it doesn't have enough time to evolve.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So,
you know, evolutionists have always manufactured various theories. They tell us that it takes millions and millions of years for the oil beds to be made and for the various animals to turn into that. In North Alabama, just north of us here, when they were putting down bridges for the railroad, they went down, and some of those that had been in there about 200 years had already turned to anthracite coal.
wow.
When they went down to repair those and to fix those. So it doesn't take that, besides the fact that when God created the heavens and the earth and adorned everything, God made it look as though it had the appearance of age. Because look what Adam and Eve. Could Adam and Eve bear children? They could. Why? Because they were made of that age.
So basically what you're saying is that even though everything was created in its mature state, it may have revealed itself to be years old.
Right.
But in all reality, it was only 1 second old.
That's right.
So with that being the case, my friends, understand this. Scientists will use this word carbon dating to be their proof for evolution and time and all this other stuff. My friends, just the fact that a tree may, whenever it was created, may have given the appearance of 100 years old. In all reality, it was only 1 second old. Therefore, guess what? The carbon dating aspect will never work. Never work. Let me give you an example. I had a preaching friend who I heard this from. He gave this illustration. He said that he had a preaching friend that wanted to challenge some of these scientists on this whole carbon dating deal. And well, his family dog died, and he went back there into the backyard and buried him and everything. And a little bit of time had passed, and he said, I just want to see what they'll say about this. So he dug his dog up, okay? Now, some of y'all may be saying, why in the world would he do that, right? He did. He took one of the bones and took it over there to the scientist, and he said, would you do me a favor? I found this in my backyard. Could you date it? Tell me how old this is. And oh boy, the guy was ecstatic. So he goes in there and he dates it, and he comes back to him maybe like a week later after he'd done a bunch of tests and things. He says, buddy, this bone is a so-and-so million years old. He said, oh, that's funny. I just buried that dog like 3 weeks ago. He said, I think I made a mistake. Come back a little bit later and I'll tell you then. Guys, don't trust the foolishness of these scientists. There's a difference in true science and scientism, all right? Understand this falsified Big Bang Theory, evolution, and things like that, and the carbon dating that you're reading about in science books, things like that. Understand something. These are all plagued from atheism. They're trying to throw God out of the picture. And here's the thing. You cannot believe that there is a God and believe in evolution at the same time.
Okay.
One is fact, one is fiction. So with that being the case, I think we can really ask this actual question. If you were to ask yourself the question, just how old is this place that we call Earth? My friends, it is 5 days older than man. That's how simple of an answer that could actually be. We don't have to have PhD behind our name. We don't have to say that we're in the realm of Scientology and all this other stuff and scientism and all that. We don't have to do that. It's either you take the word for what it says or you don't.
That's right.
That's how simple it is. And so in all reality, as we start concluding this thing, God created the earth in 6 literal days and rested on the 7th day. There is absolutely no place for the billions of years as evolutionists contend. And therefore, my friends, may God give us the courage to stand for and contend for the faith that you read about in the scriptures and not in your science books. So, friends, I know this has been a good 2-lesson series, and Clifford, I've enjoyed this.
Absolutely.
But it's something that really needs to be talked about. It's something that we all need to be discussing. And because parents understand this, like I said last week, if your child is taking a science class, doesn't matter if it's the very first one, understand they're teaching this hogwash. It's so important that we teach our children the truth.
Amen.
Teach them. Teach them, teach them. And you know what you have to do in order to teach them? Take this book and teach them this book. Let this do the teaching, and let not man do the teaching.
And Wes, something that's important with that, it's not a matter that this is just written for preachers or teachers.
No.
This was written for everybody.
Exactly.
Just like the book of Genesis. And it will give you all of those answers.
Absolutely, absolutely. So friends, if we can answer any questions, if you have any comments that you want to make, please make it in the comment section below. You can even reach us by telephone if you want to call me or text me. My phone number is 251-289-9825. Again, that is 251-289-9825. And so please just text us. Let us know if we can help you in your studies or anything of that nature. And just let us let you know that we are here for you. If we can help you in any way, please just let us know. But until next time, Lord willing, next Tuesday night, 7 p.m., we'll be right here on Central Bible Talk. We love you. Hope you have a great day. See you next time.